Welcome to Habitat Live. One of the big questions facing boards and managing agents is what to do about annual meetings and board elections. Some have postponed them until next year, and others are wondering if they could be held online. My guest today is Tom Smith, partner at Smith, Buss & Jacobs. Tom is one of the few who has ventured down the online path, and his firm has developed a protocol on how to do it using Zoom. So let's dive right in. My first question is, who should be considering Zoom meetings and who shouldn't?
Well, as you said in your presentation, most boards are just deferring to the fall, but with the uncertainty about gatherings continuing possibly into the fall and the comfort factor with shareholders joining them, even if they're permitted, more and more boards are thinking that they can't continually push the annual meeting down the road and have begun to inquire about the process for doing so. It works clearly well for the buildings with 100 or fewer shareholders. We haven't had the opportunity yet to try it for larger buildings, although our Zoom license would accommodate 500 participants. But we do know that it has been comfortable and worked well for buildings that are 100 or fewer. One other dynamic that we haven't had the experience with yet is in a hotly contested election with a dissident slate looking to gain control of a board. We haven't had that opportunity yet to see how this would work in that environment, but it should work the same, especially if the board can manage to get a consensus on the Zoom protocols going into it, in which case neither side would be able to claim that they were prejudiced by that alternative forum from a normal meeting.
Okay, so I assume the process of the annual meeting notification is still required, but what, if anything, is different when you take the meeting online?
So as you'll hear about in the process and see from the protocol, it relies to a large degree on encouraging shareholders to vote by the proxy ballot that is distributed as part of the process. For that reason, it's important to set the sequence of events properly and, for example, including nomination process in advance of the meeting so that the proxy ballot can be distributed at least 2 weeks before the meeting with the names of the candidates already included in the proxy ballot. And we call it a proxy ballot, so to encourage the connection among shareholders with that is how they're voting, as opposed to giving authority to vote to somebody else. The other part of it is in extending your email distribution list to shareholders as much as possible. The Zoom protocol does allow for shareholders who perhaps don't have access to a laptop or internet access to participate by telephone, but you want as many people as possible to be able to see the proceedings and to participate visually as well. So the initial notices encourage everyone to deliver their email address to the managing agent.
So now I'm a building and I have a managing agent. I've decided to do the Zoom meeting. I want to send out my annual notice, and I send it out via email because the building probably has, or the managing agent probably has shareholders' emails, and also by...
The notice also is sent by mail to make sure that anyone who does not have access to email or is not familiar with using it is advised of the meeting through the mail. We would also encourage the managing agent to have the notices published, posted somewhere in the building where people are likely to see it. And again, encourage those who have not provided their email to do so that they can fully participate.
And does the annual notice say it includes a proxy ballot and the fact that this annual meeting is going to be on Zoom?
Yes. Each building that we've done it with, there have been some variations on the model that we have developed. But for simplicity's sake, the model that we start with includes the The notice of annual meeting has been developed to give simple instructions to shareholders on how to connect to the meeting and a description of the process. And in some cases, boards have wanted us to do a full memo on it separate and apart from the annual meeting. But generally speaking, we've developed simplified forms that lay it out as simply as possible so that people are both getting notice of the meeting and an explanation of how to connect to it at the same time.
So your protocol recommends a practice session. Can you talk about what that is and how that works and how you set that up or when it's set up?
Sure. I think everyone who might be viewing this has had an experiences with Zoom in the last 8 weeks, more than they ever imagined. But when we were developing this program, it was not so clear that everybody would be technologically comfortable in connecting or have, as I said, the facilities to be able to do that. So the practice session was originally built into the protocol so that you can avoid those first 10 minutes of any Zoom call where people are figuring out, staring at their screen, trying to figure out how to get video live, how to get audio live, and getting a little bit familiar with both the functions, but also comfortable in the environment so that when there comes an opportunity for them either to participate, ask questions, make comments, they're not going to be camera shy. They'll have gone through a practice session. Another important potential function for the practice session is in the circumstances where a board has more on the agenda than just the election of shareholders. So one of the 3 that we've performed so far had been working on an amendment to the proprietary lease to address and insert some insurance requirement provisions. And normally we might have had an information session at the building to go through it, explain why it's important. So the information session gives the opportunity in advance of the actual meeting to discuss that and to fill people in on it. Also, it could be used as a candidates forum. Once you've had the nominations, some buildings have the practice of setting a night aside, inviting shareholders and giving the candidates an opportunity to make their pitch. And since we can't do that due to the social distancing, the practice session could be formulated to provide that as one of the purposes of it.
And just to insert this, for those people who don't have a computer or are not comfortable, Zoom allows you to call in on a regular phone line.
That's correct. The Zoom notice of the meeting gives the phone numbers and the information that you would need so that you can participate fully audibly. And the screen on Zoom shows that you're participating. It's just a black box instead of a Hollywood Squares personal box.
Okay. And how much before the annual meeting would you hold your practice session?
Generally speaking, we do that just a couple of days before, but that you could be flexible depending on if there are other purposes, such as an amendment to the lease or a candidates night. You can set it up, and as I said, each of the buildings has had some variations on the general protocol, so you would adapt it to meet the needs. But if it's just to make people comfortable, as the normal case, then doing it as close to the meeting as possible is a good idea so that it's fresh in people's minds on that night.
Okay, so let's say it's showtime.
Yeah.
And just before we get to how the meetings run, your firm, and in your experience, your firm is running this. I mean, you mentioned earlier it's your firm's license. So how many people at your firm have been involved in the running of the meeting?
Well, myself and my partner, Eric Blaha, generally team up on these. And the reason is that there are functions that are part of the protocol in the Zoom application that take some coordination. So if you're focusing on the content of the meeting and sharing the meeting, it's easier to have a second person who's focusing on when to mute everybody, when to unmute individuals, monitoring the chat function. We also, for example, if there are questions and you want to be recognized and for some reason you're not participating by Zoom, we start the meeting by giving an introduction describing a text number that people can call and an email address that they can use to contact. That way have somebody helping us. Having two people involved means somebody can monitor those and tip off the chairman that somebody needs to be recognized or that there's something else going on that should be dealt with.
So before we get into the sort of rules and limitations, now there's, let's say 70 of us have showed up and we see 70 little screens and we see some people have called in on the phone, and I have a question. How do I get somebody's attention?
So, as in the case of an in-person annual meeting, people raise their hands to be recognized. And if you are participating with the video on Zoom, we can see that. If you're not participating, we would be giving you the second person's text number, and you can send a text to them identifying yourself and asking to be recognized. And since you are present on the Zoom screen, even if we can't see you, we can connect that and just recognize that person and give them the opportunity. We'd also generally encourage people to submit their questions in advance of the meeting so that it keeps it more orderly, and the chair or the appropriate officer can respond to the question at the right time during the program.
So do you normally have the board, the managing agent, the auditor, whoever is going to make the reports? Is that typically, in your experience with these Zoom meetings, do you set that up front and then hold questions from the back, or is it all combined?
So the agenda and the running of the meeting is virtually the same as it would be if it's in person. One exception is that in many boards, we're routinely asked to chair the meeting as the law firm, and then call on the different officers to make their reports and to respond to questions. But because of our familiarity with the functions of the program, we strongly encourage boards to designate us to chair the meeting at the outset. And then we just proceed with the formal requirements like confirmation of due calling of the meeting, verification that a quorum is present, which is another interesting part of this Zoom process, and a waiver of the reading of the minutes. And then, as in a normal agenda, you would recognize generally the board president to give his report on the events of the last year and ideas about the cooperative or condominiums plans for the future. Some boards, as in every in-person meeting, allow and encourage questions and answers after each of the reports. Some buildings try to defer the questions and answers till a later point in the meeting, usually under new business. However, all of us in the business have experience where sometimes shareholders just can't be dissuaded from speaking up when something is said that they have an interest in. So we do find that this forum does permit a board to regulate the agenda in some ways more clearly and easily than an in-person meeting, partly because participants are a little camera shy perhaps, but you have that important mute function. And so you have an ability technologically to do what you don't do in person, is press a button to regulate whose opportunity it is to speak.
And what do you do? I don't know if in your experience, what do you do about the one guy who won't shut up?
Well, again, that's the main part of the mute function. And it's been my experience through hundreds, if not thousands, of annual meetings that when a board tries to restrict opportunities to speak, and there are issues that perhaps shareholders feel strongly about, it's usually counterproductive to try to suppress the conversation and push it to a specific time slot. If anything, that gets people frustrated and angry, and it tends to cause more chaos at a meeting than if you simply go through the process and deal with it as people feel the absolute need to address something. In this case, it really does come down again to the important mute button, and very quickly, if there is a shareholder who feels that urge to speak out even beyond in a time other than is set forth for it, they quickly realize that nobody can hear them and it's futile, and therefore they get with the program as quickly as possible.
So, bottom line, how would you rate? Now, you've conducted several meetings on Zoom. How would you rate that experience against in-person experience?
Well, there are positives and negatives. In this environment that we're all living in, we have found that shareholders really appreciated an opportunity to connect with each other and with their boards. And even though it's not perfect and in person, it's better than the anonymous email or the email communications or memos slipped under doors. And people have really expressed some appreciation for having that opportunity. It also gives the board in these unusual times an opportunity to talk about not only the policies reacting to the COVID virus, but hear people's human interest stories, their stories of how it's impacted them. And it's been a nice opportunity for people to do that. Similarly, it does allow for an orderly meeting because of those functions that we talked about. As I said at the outset, we haven't had an opportunity yet to do this where there's a hotly contested election. My suspicion, my guess is that unless there was a consensus on the rules on the protocol, that the side that loses, whether it's the incumbents or the dissidents, would claim that their position was prejudiced and biased and affected negatively by doing this by Zoom instead of personal. And the team that won would undoubtedly be 100% sure that it was a fair process. But I'll look forward to the first time that we have that opportunity to, I'll get back to you and fill you in on how that worked out.
All right, I have one more question. Now, many have said you can't hold, I believe, annual meetings or elections unless your bylaws say that you can.
That is, with the case of a cooperative organized under the Business Corporation Law, that is definitely not the case. The governor's executive order specifically permitted shareholder meetings in corporations. It is not clear, because a condominium association is generally not incorporated, if the governor's order, which only addressed the Business Corporation Law, would apply. But in many other areas of the law, courts have routinely deferred and applied the same corporate concepts to condominium associations. And my sense of the court system is that the judges would also take into consideration the extraordinary circumstances that boards made those decisions. So I think it's really unlikely that somebody would successfully challenge the conduct of a condominium meeting, and I'm certain that they wouldn't succeed in challenging a cooperative meeting. And
could you imagine when we're past this pandemic that many co-ops and some condos would want to continue with Zoom annual meetings?
I think it's possible that in many other ways, our culture and lifestyles may change as a result of the experiences that we've had during the last 8 or 10 weeks. I do know that at least in one of the buildings, and I think in a second one, the board had difficulty achieving quorum in prior years. And this time, because of the convenience of a Zoom meeting, their attendance levels were higher than has been their history recently. It seems getting home from a long day work, trying to have a fast dinner, say hello to family, and then leave the house again to go to a remote location or to a laundry room or a lobby to hold an in-person meeting is, for some people, even if they're well-intentioned and would like to, just becomes difficult. The convenience of the Zoom meeting seems so far to be encouraging participation in that way. But at the same time, the personal connection is going to be important, I believe. So we'll have to see how that goes. I think every building's personality is different. Every board is different. And the circumstances that a board is confronting year to year differ from year to year. So there may be years when it is appropriate and boards would choose to do it that way, and other years where they would feel it would be more important to have an in-person meeting. So we'll have to see how it goes.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to let our audience know that the protocols that Tom's firm has developed, we will be hosting on our website when this Habitat Live video appears in the next few days. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you, Carol. Have a good day.
Thank you.